Kim Vowden. I'm from the immigration team at Kingsley, Napley. I'm very pleased to be joined by Reid from RSM. Lucy, do you want to say a few words about yourself and what you do?
Thank you, Kim. Yes, my name's Reid. I'm a director at RSM, and I deal primarily with helping employers either with people that are overseas coming to the UK or the other way around. So anything to do with expatriates, global mobility and remote workers, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Thanks, Lucy. So today we're here to talk about remote working, so in particular, international remote working. The more and more people are living in one country while they're working for a company in another country. Some people have been doing this for a while, digital nomads and so on, but it's become a lot more mainstream. And because of coronavirus, it's exploded. Lots of us are working from home. I'm working from home. Lots of us are doing this. And a lot more people are working from homes in other countries. So in our immigration team, we get lots of questions from our clients about this. Usually it's a UK company which tells us they've got one of their employees wants to work from the Canary Islands or Australia or wherever. And sometimes they've already been doing that for a while and they come to us and say, look, is this okay? Now there's an immigration part to this, which is usually fairly clear cut. So on the immigration side, we want to know, well, do they need the right to work in the country where they're living? Because different countries have different policies about this. So for instance, in the UK, if a foreign national wants to work remotely in the UK for an overseas employer, they can do that as part of a visit, as long as they're visiting for some other purpose. So they're not coming here just in order to work remotely. They can do that, but there are some limits around that, and they're limited to 6 months. What they can't do is come here in order to live here long term. But some countries are a lot stricter about that. Some countries you can't do any work at all without a work visa, even if the employer is in another country. So if the person does need the right to work, then we think, well, do they have it? And at the moment, so for lots of British people who are working in the EU, it's very straightforward. Yes, they do that. They have free movement rights. That's easy. But we're coming to the end of the Brexit transition period. So British people moving to the EU after the end of this year, they won't have those rights. And we've actually done some webinars on that subject with our EU partners recently, so do check those out. Now that's just the immigration piece, but there's a lot more to it than that. And that's why Lucy is here. So Lucy, remote working. So remote workers, it's such a common theme now compared to a year ago. What are the types of remote worker that you're seeing?
So we're seeing obviously a lot of international remote workers, as you rightly pointed out, and these can range anything from somebody who has a holiday home, and that typically tends to be in France or Spain, and they want to go and work there during lockdown, but also domestic remote workers. So somebody may perhaps have been working in England and then may have spent lockdown in Scotland, and of course they have a different income tax rate now, so that can produce some interesting answers. And then the other sort of category really is what I'd call people that are hired remotely. So remote hires where companies are deciding that actually they're going to utilise this enlarged global talent pool that is now available, and really leverage that remote working model. So those are broadly the three that we see.
And how do employers deal with that?
Well, again, there is a real mix in terms of how employers are dealing with this. There's a couple of different schools of thought. There are some employers, and you may have seen in the press recently around Google and large companies like them, saying that the employees have to return to their home country or their home office location to work because they don't really want to be bothered with any additional compliance issues around the world. And then there are some organisations that are really embracing remote working, and they're really very much seeing it as the way forwards, and they're trying to put into place mechanisms by which they can actually leverage a better quality of work, a better quality of candidate for jobs and so on a global basis. So it's quite interesting seeing the two different approaches. And then of course there are the employers sort of somewhere in the middle that they're just sort of trying to muddle through and come to terms with what might have happened that they weren't aware of and just deal with the best way of moving forward with what they've got.
What are the key things that employers need to look out for when they've got the situation, when they've got remote workers?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's quite a long list. I could go on about this for a long time, but I'll try and keep it quite short. I think with any employer, one of the key things to think about is perhaps something that you don't necessarily naturally think about when it comes to employment taxes is that person, wherever they're working, creating a corporate presence or permanent establishment of the business overseas where they might be working. And that's obviously quite a key thing. And we would always recommend having a review of that position, but very broadly, the more senior the individual and the more contracts they are concluding, the more likely it is that they are going to be creating a corporate presence in the overseas location. So that's a really key one to watch out for, because of course, once you create a corporate presence, then a lot of other things then follow on from there. Irrespective of the corporate presence, there can also be payroll obligations in the country that the person has chosen to work in, particularly if they've been there for quite a long period of time. And we're increasingly seeing the situation whereby people have been somewhere since March when lockdown happened, and obviously we're now way more than 183 days beyond that. So a lot of people are perhaps becoming resident in the countries that they are sort of working in. And that creates, in some cases, payroll withholding obligations for the employer. The other piece that is probably important to not forget is around social security. It's quite often lumped together with withholding taxes, but social security, particularly in some of the locations that I mentioned before, such as France, can be onerously high. So I think one of the sort of high level employer contribution rates in France is around 56%, which is obviously an enormous cost to a business if you've got an employee that sits in that bracket. So again, social security costs shouldn't be ignored, in particular at the moment when we're coming to the end of the transition period with Brexit. And of course, we don't know exactly at this moment in time. Obviously, by the time this goes out, there may be some amendments, but we don't know at this moment in time how that's going to be treated beyond 1st of January. So there is a possibility that there could be double social security withholdings in some of those jurisdictions. So just to watch out for that side of things. Clearly, as you've mentioned, Kim, there's the immigration piece. Do these individuals have the right to work in the country that they've opted to work in? And are they overstaying the welcome of perhaps the tourist visa that they've gone in on? I won't go into that in any detail. But there's also the employment law aspects of this. And I know that you guys deal with this a huge amount, but there are some countries around the world where if you're working there for a certain period of time, then you gain employment rights in that country, and again your employer has to adhere to some of the employment rights to be given to you as an employee. So that's a very important one to watch out for as well, alongside other sort of peripheral issues such as health and safety. There are some jurisdictions around the world that require you to inspect an individual's workplace within 30 days of them starting work there. Now, clearly not everyone is going to go out to their employees' holiday homes to inspect them. But again, it's just how employers sort of work around those sorts of rules. And then insurances and benefits. So where an employer is providing benefits to employees, such as private medical, or there might be a life insurance policy, or there might be just general employee insurances that perhaps the employee isn't aware of behind the scenes. Does that cover the employees when they're not working in the UK? If the individual has an accident at work, or if there's any issue such as the employee getting into some sort of hot water, does your professional indemnity insurance, for example, does that cover when the individual is not actually working in the country that is covered under the policy? So it's always just worth looking into the policies that employers have in place, just to check again that there aren't any issues that you're unwittingly walking into.
So there's a lot of issues there. It sounds complex and a bit of a nightmare. Is there any easy way of navigating through all of this stuff?
Yes, I mean, I think every jurisdiction clearly has its own rules, and every territory is going to have slightly different ways of doing things. But I think, what we're seeing increasingly is clients coming to us in exactly the way that you described at the beginning of this discussion, saying, oh, we've just realised that we've got somebody in country X or country Y, what are the issues, and can you help us resolve them? And obviously going through that process, we engage with our with our offices overseas, and obviously rectify any situations that have happened to date. But I think the most important piece is the sort of going forwards. How do you ensure that this sort of stuff doesn't happen in the future? And I think that's the really interesting piece for me, is around helping our clients put in place remote worker policies so that there is this kind of framework around which they can just make sure that the individuals aren't accidentally tripping up any of the triggers for things like permanent establishment, payroll, all of those sorts of things, and that there are key points at which the individuals has to contact the HR business partner or whoever it may be in the organisation that they have a direct contact with, just to make them aware of the activities they're doing, the days that they're working in the country, and so on.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think, just finally, do you think there are any positives coming out of this trend to remote work?
Absolutely. It's my own personal opinion that I think this could be the sort of the way forward. People talk about the new normal, and I really do believe that I've seen it with some of my clients whereby they have been struggling to recruit for a position in London, and now all of a sudden it's opened up hugely. They can look at a global talent pool, they can recruit someone in, let's say, Bulgaria or Hungary in this particular example. The salary costs over there are slightly lower. What they've done with that is they've used that to offset some of the compliance costs that are involved in running payroll and so on over there. But what that does is it also means that you've got a more diverse workforce. Especially important, I think, in this day and age, when I talk to some of our clients who perhaps are based in geographical regions of the UK, which through no fault of their own are just not very diverse, and I live in one of those locations myself, it's quite exciting actually to think that because you don't have a location restriction on where you're asking people to be, you can actually afford to go out to market and really have a very diverse talent pool opened up to you. So things like fulfilling quotas, and I hate to use that word, but for female leadership, ethnic minorities, disabilities, all of those sorts of things become infinitely more possible with remote working. So it's a really, really positive outcome to all of this. And then one example I just wanted to give actually was one of my clients who I dealt with probably about 2 years ago, who had a remote working issue, and back then this was obviously quite an unusual thing. They realised that actually they had somebody who'd been in Australia for almost a year. And so we worked with them to try and get the position rectified to date. But they decided this person was actually very key and it had been working quite well. So they were going to continue with having that person working remotely in Australia. Now, fast forward 2 years and the pandemic has hit. At a certain point in the pandemic, they realised that actually they were not making as much money in the UK market as they would like, but the Australian market was booming. And they were able to use this individual that was already in Australia to try and make inroads into the Australian market that was booming. So by a completely happy accident, and by them being forward thinking enough to put that person in that position of being a remote worker, they were able to take advantage of it later on down the track when the pandemic hit. So that's quite a nice sort of good news story about it. I think there is a lot of doom and gloom around all of the bits and pieces that are involved, but actually if it's managed correctly and you have the right advice, there's no reason why remote working shouldn't stop you expanding your business.
That's a very positive note to end on. Lucy, that's a great summary, and I'm sure it'll be very helpful to everyone listening. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to everyone for listening. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.